There is a number that nobody in the United States government is saying out loud right now. It is not classified. It is not hidden behind a security clearance that only 12 people in Washington hold. It is a number that anyone with access to publicly available satellite imagery, open source intelligence reporting, and a basic understanding of how missile defense systems work under sustained operational pressure could calculate if they sat down and did the math carefully enough. The reason nobody is saying it out loud is not because it is secret. The reason nobody is saying it out loud is because the moment you say it out loud, you change the calculation for every actor in this conflict simultaneously. And right now, every person in a position of authority who knows what that number is has made a quiet, unspoken decision that the world is better off not knowing it yet. By the end of this video, you are going to understand what that number represents, why it matters more than anything else happening in this conflict right now, and why the next 48 hours are not just another 48 hours in a war that has already produced more 48-hour crises than anyone thought possible when this started. But first, I need you to understand something about how conflicts like this one actually work, because the way they are covered in the media, the way they appear in the headlines, the way they feel when you are watching from the outside is almost perfectly designed to make you misunderstand what is actually happening and why it matters. Every day in this conflict has felt urgent. Every day has produced a moment that was described as potentially escalatory, potentially decisive, potentially the turning point after which nothing would be the same. And every day, the world woke up the next morning and the conflict was still there, still grinding, still producing casualties and displacement and economic damage, but not having crossed the threshold that would force the international community to reckon with what is actually at stake. That pattern has conditioned everyone watching, including people who should know better, to discount the urgency of any given moment, to assume that whatever is being described as potentially catastrophic will, like every previous potentially catastrophic moment in this conflict, resolve into another grinding day of the same. That assumption is not wrong as a historical observation about the first 27 days of this conflict. It is catastrophically wrong as a prediction about the next 48 hours. And the reason it is wrong is not rhetorical and not an attempt to manufacture tension where none exists. The reason it is wrong is structural, mathematical, and visible to anyone who understands three specific dynamics that have converged tonight in a way they have never converged before. The first dynamic is what military planners call the suppression gap, and it is the thing that was supposed to prevent this moment from ever arriving. When American and Israeli strikes began on February 28th, the operational theory was straightforward. Sustained, concentrated air power applied to Iranian missile production, storage, and launch infrastructure would degrade Iran's ability to fire precision missiles at deep Israeli targets faster than Iran could fire them. The math was supposed to work in a specific direction. Every precision missile destroyed in its storage facility is a precision missile that cannot be fired at Tel Aviv. Every production facility degraded is a facility that cannot replace the missiles being destroyed. And the cumulative effect of 28 days of the most concentrated American air power applied to a single adversary since the first Gulf War was supposed to be an Iran that had been reduced from an existential threat to a manageable problem. A country that retained enough military capability to claim it had not been destroyed, but not enough to conduct the kind of deep precision strikes that changed the strategic calculus of the conflict entirely. That was the theory. Tonight, Iran fired precision missiles that struck deep inside Israel with an accuracy that the suppression campaign was supposed to have made impossible by now. The suppression gap is real, it is significant, and it means that every operational assumption built on top of the theory that Iran would be militarily degraded to irrelevance by day 28 now needs to be rebuilt from scratch in a window where there is no time to rebuild anything carefully. The second dynamic is the one that the number I mentioned at the beginning of this video represents, and it is the dynamic that military planners in Jerusalem are thinking about with more urgency than anything else happening on any of the active fronts right now. Every missile defense system ever built by any country in the history of modern warfare has the same fundamental constraint. It has a finite number of interceptors. It can produce more interceptors, and it can receive more interceptors from allies, and it can develop more efficient interception protocols that reduce the number of interceptors used per incoming threat. But at any given moment, the number of interceptors available to defend against incoming fire is a finite number, and that finite number is being drawn down every single day of this conflict at a rate that was calculated against a specific assumption about how long the conflict would last and how many simultaneous fronts Israel would need to defend against. The assumption was wrong on both counts. The conflict is on day 28 with no end visible in the structure of the diplomatic situation. And tonight, for the first time, Israel is defending against 3 simultaneous missile fronts: Iran firing from the east, Hezbollah firing from the north with more than 3,500 rockets, missiles, and drones launched since March 2nd. And now, for the first time, the Houthis firing from the south. 3 fronts, finite interceptors, a resupply chain from the United States that is moving as fast as it can move and is still not moving fast enough to replace what 3 simultaneous fronts are consuming every day. The number that nobody is saying out loud is the number of days before the interceptor inventory reaches the threshold below which the defensive architecture of the entire country changes in ways that affect every subsequent military and diplomatic decision. It is not 0 yet. But it is not large, and it is getting smaller every day that 3 fronts are simultaneously active. The third dynamic is the one that makes the next 48 hours structurally different from every previous 48 hours, and it involves a clock that was set publicly in front of the entire world by the President of the United States. Trump's ultimatum to Iran to open the Strait of Hormuz within 48 hours or face American strikes on Iranian power plants was not a casual statement. It was not the kind of thing that American presidents say to create diplomatic pressure and then quietly walk back when the pressure fails to produce the desired result without anyone in the international community particularly noticing. It was a public commitment with a specific timeline made in a moment of maximum international visibility, and it was answered by Iran not with diplomatic signals through the Pakistani back channel that had been quietly producing progress, not with any gesture toward compliance or negotiation, but with precision missiles striking deep inside Israeli cities at the moment the clock was running down. Iran's answer to America's ultimatum was written in the language of fire falling on Israeli population centers, and now the President of the United States has to decide what to do about that answer in a window that is measured in hours rather than days. The reason that decision is so difficult, the reason the people making it in Washington right now are working under a kind of pressure that the public communications around this conflict have consistently understated, is that every option available to American decision makers in the next 48 hours carries consequences that extend far beyond this conflict and far beyond this region. If Trump follows through on the power plant threat, the humanitarian damage to Iranian civilian infrastructure produces an international response that makes the diplomatic coalition around this conflict significantly harder to maintain. It accelerates the probability of full Hormuz closure. It triggers Iranian strikes on Gulf desalination infrastructure that would create a water access crisis for tens of millions of people across the Arabian Peninsula within days. And it does all of that in a moment when the global economy is already absorbing the compounding damage of Hormuz being closed for 28 consecutive days and the Red Sea becoming an active conflict zone simultaneously. The 2 most critical maritime choke points connecting Asia, the Middle East, and Europe are both under military threat at the same moment. The global supply chain disruption that results is not a number you can model cleanly because the interactions between simultaneous disruptions at that scale produce effects that compound rather than add, and no model built before this conflict assumed both choke points would be simultaneously threatened for a sustained period. If Trump does not follow through on the power plant threat, the credibility cost of a second public delay in the face of Iranian noncompliance is a cost paid not just in this conflict and not just in this region. It is a cost paid in every future communication American deterrence makes to every adversary in every domain for years. The signal that a public American ultimatum with a specific timeline can be defied through escalation rather than compliance, and that defiance will produce a second deadline rather than consequences, is a signal that reshapes the landscape of American strategic credibility in ways that American foreign policy has to live with long after this conflict ends, whatever form that ending takes. And if Trump attempts the third option, the calibrated middle path that experienced analysts in Washington are urgently trying to construct, the military action significant enough to demonstrate that the ultimatum produced consequences, but carefully enough calibrated to avoid the specific triggers that lead to power plant strikes and full escalation. He faces the challenge that Iran's precision strikes on Israeli cities have narrowed the space in which a calibrated response can be constructed without looking inadequate to the gravity of what Iran just did. A response that appears insufficient to the scale of tonight's escalation tells Iran and every other adversary watching this conflict that escalating in the face of American ultimatums produces American restraint rather than American consequences. And that is the worst possible message to send at the worst possible moment to send it. In Jerusalem, the Security Cabinet met through the night in what multiple Israeli media sources describe as the most consequential meeting of the entire conflict. The options on the table include strikes on Iranian nuclear-adjacent facilities that Washington has been holding Israel back from throughout this conflict because of the escalation risks they carry. They include strikes on Iranian leadership and command infrastructure at a depth and scale that would cross thresholds that have never been crossed in the history of the Israeli-Iranian confrontation. They include accelerated ground operations in Lebanon to physically push Hezbollah's missile capacity further from the border. And they include a response to the Houthi entry that requires coordination with American naval assets in the Red Sea. Netanyahu has said the campaign continues at full force. The question his cabinet is answering tonight is not whether to respond. It is how far beyond anything Israel has yet done in this conflict that response will go. The diplomatic variable that most public analysis has consistently underweighted is Pakistan. Pakistan is the only country currently maintaining active communication with both Washington and Tehran in a channel that both sides have treated as serious enough to actually shape their behavior around. The Pakistani Foreign Ministry's silence this morning, in the hours after precision missiles struck Israeli cities, represents either a channel temporarily overwhelmed by events that needs time to process before resuming, or a channel broken by the magnitude of the gap that tonight's escalation has opened between the two positions it was trying to bridge. The difference between those two interpretations is the difference between whether a diplomatic exit from the next 48 hours exists or whether all three clocks, the ultimatum clock, the interceptor inventory clock, and the Iranian strategic utility clock, run to their conclusions without a negotiated intervention. Two outcomes are possible: a negotiated framework constructed through Pakistan or another back channel, requiring all three actors to simultaneously accept less than their stated objective in exchange for an exit that prevents what the alternative produces, or sequential escalation through thresholds that each individually seem manageable, but that in combination produce a conflict past the point where any existing international mechanism can contain it. The first outcome requires active, urgent, conscious decision-making in Washington, Jerusalem, and Tehran simultaneously, with enough political will in all three capitals to prioritize the exit over the next military move. The second outcome requires nothing. It requires only that the inertia of a conflict already at this level of intensity carries each actor to their next decision before the alternative can be constructed. Inertia is always easier than will, and right now, inertia is pointing in one direction. The 48 hours have started, the clocks are running, and the number that nobody is saying out loud is getting smaller.